First of all, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to Bilahari for inviting me to participate at this conference, and I also would say that I'm very delighted to be able to be sitting in the same panel as friends whom I've known for some years already. Shamsaran, for example, and I were colleagues as ambassadors in Jakarta. And of course, Dr. Ibtisam, I know as she organizes one of the most important conferences in the Middle East, the Abu Dhabi Strategic Debate. And I'm very pleased to be able to meet Professor Wang Jen as well as Mr. Michael Singh at this panel. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the title of this session is The New Middle East Security Architecture. And there is a question asked, is it a mirage? This imagery, I think, is very important. Given the desert setting and all that, it would seem that, something of a mirage is either not there or is so far away and is so difficult to achieve that it will take a lot of effort to do so. But I'm pretty sure that given all the developments that have occurred in the Middle East in the last few years, and for that matter, now in the last few months, I think serious efforts could be taken by the countries concerned in order to form a security architecture that would guarantee the security, stability, and economic development of the region in years to come. Now, the previous panel has already addressed some of the issues that I believe our panelists will cover at this session, but I'm pretty sure that you will be interested to know more of what the panelists think as to what is the security architecture in the Middle East, and for that matter, what should be the security architecture in the Middle East. For those of us in this region, in Southeast Asia, as well as in the Indo-Pacific region, the debate on the security architecture, or for that matter, the regional architecture of this region has been going on for so many years. As Bilahari has mentioned, it started well even before ASEAN was established in 1967. But lately, of course, as we can see, there has been the development of various mechanisms, not only the US alliance systems with countries in the region, the hubs and spokes system, the nuclear umbrella provided by the United States for some of the countries that are allies of the United States in the region, but also, quite importantly, the existence of ASEAN and the ASEAN-centered mechanisms. I think that could possibly be one of the examples that could be emulated by our friends from the Middle East. But of course, there is also the European security architecture that I think is worth looking at. So without further ado, may I begin the session by inviting Ambassador Shamsaran to speak. Just as a note to the speakers, I've been told that we should end by 1:30, and may I request the speakers to spend about 10 minutes making a presentation, after which we will have a question and answer session. Sham, please.
Thank you very much. Let me begin by expressing my thanks to the Middle East Institute and its President, Ambassador Bilahari Kausikan, for inviting me to this 2023 annual conference on the Middle East. My greetings to our session chairman, Ambassador Tanjri Rastam, a very old friend, and also my other distinguished panelists. The conference theme refers to the new Middle East. The new presumably is due to the perception that great power competition has returned to the region after presumably having been absent or relatively low in salience. Great power competition has remained an enduring feature in the region for as long as one can remember, even though the set of actors may have changed and the nature of the competition may have evolved over time. India is an adjacent power with significant interests and engagement with the countries of the Middle East. So I thought I will give you perhaps an Indian perspective on this particular theme. The region is important to India's energy security, being the main source of its oil and gas. After China, India is the second largest importer of oil, of which 52.7% comes from the Middle East, and the volumes are likely to grow as India's growth picks up speed in the coming decade. There are 9 million Indians who live and work in the Middle East. Their safety and welfare are a continuing concern, and the remittances which they send to India now total a substantial $15 billion per year. More recently, countries in the Middle East, in particularly the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, have become major sources of foreign investment in India. UAE is the first country in the region with which India has concluded a comprehensive economic partnership agreement. As an Indian ocean power, India has important security stakes in the eastern as well as the western reaches of the Indian Ocean. Its naval forces maintain a modest presence in the region, and there are security partnerships with virtually all key partners in the region. What does the current geopolitical landscape in the region look like from the perspective of India? We believe that the US continues to be the most formidable military power in the region, with key allies and security partners, including Turkey, a NATO member, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain, where in fact the US Fifth Fleet is headquartered. These naval assets are a part of the US Central Command, which is headquartered in Tampa, Florida, but is operationally responsible for the Middle East, Central Asia, a part of South Asia, that is Afghanistan and Pakistan. If great power competition in the Cold War was mainly between the US and the Soviet Union, today that competition is beginning to shape up between the US and China, and residually between the US and Russia, which still maintains some military presence in the region. US power remains predominant, but regional equations are changing largely because of the diminishing credibility of US security assurances to its allies and partners in the region. This theme was also covered in the earlier panel and also in the conversation between Bilahari and Minister. This credibility issue arises out of what the key Middle Eastern countries see as the failure of the US to support local elites in upholding regime security, which is their chief preoccupation. The doubts about the US go back to the Arab Spring of 2011 and the abandonment of Hosni Mubarak, the Egyptian leader. For Saudi Arabia, it is the US failure to safeguard Saudi Arabia against the missile and drone attacks from Yemen, which was seen as instigated by its chief rival, Iran. The chaotic withdrawal of US forces from Afghanistan in 2021 only exacerbated these concerns. Furthermore, the US is no longer dependent upon the Middle East, oil and gas, having become a substantial exporter itself. It has less of a stake in regional security. Lastly, the pluralized politics in the US itself heightens the sense of uncertainty in the region. These factors have triggered significant shifts in the security calculations of regional actors. The decline in US credibility has led regional actors striving to exercise greater agency in safeguarding their own security interests. There is a reordering of regional equations in progress, the potentially most significant being the recent moves towards normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran, two long-term adversaries, and also the most consequential states in the Middle East. This has also marked a more active diplomatic role of China, which has emerged as a virtual guarantor of the deal. China's interests in the region are obvious. Is this better? Yeah, okay. This has also marked a more active diplomatic role of China, which has emerged as a virtual guarantor of the deal. China's interests in the region are obvious. The Middle East remains its largest source of oil and gas supplies. It is trying to leverage its large oil purchases to support its effort towards the internationalization of its own currency, the yuan. Briefly, it wants to supplant the current petrodollar market with a petro-yuan market based in Shanghai and possibly backed by gold. A decision by main Middle East producers of oil and gas to start accepting the yuan as payment for oil and gas sales will be a big gain for China and a setback for the US globally. It is easy to see why China is so active in the region in this regard. The expanding Chinese presence in the region has also encouraged Saudi Arabia and the UAE to seek membership of the China-led Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, where India too is a member and Iran will be joining very soon. This helps the Saudi effort to diversify its relations away from the US. For China, this fits in very well with its strategy of creating a safer periphery for its substantial and growing interests in Central Asia. The Saudi-Iran Accord has triggered other shifts in the region, including the return of Syria to the Arab League. Saudi Arabia has also moved to repair its relations with Turkey, overcoming the hiatus which developed over the killing of the Saudi journalist Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul in 2018. The Shia-Sunni overlay, which was seen something of a fixity in the region, has now shaken loose to some extent. For the US, as we in India see it, the recent strategy has been oriented towards creating a regional coalition which could be tasked to safeguard its interests and that of its chief ally, Israel, even while its direct intervention and presence has been diminishing. And I think Ambassador Indik, in fact, pointed out to this particular trend. The Middle East has less salience in US calculations compared to the Indo-Pacific and now Europe, thanks to the Ukraine war. It sponsored the Abraham Accords in 2020, which formalized relations between Israel and the Gulf states of UAE and Bahrain. This was followed later by Sudan and Morocco. There are now formal relations between Israel and several Middle Eastern states, including Egypt and Jordan, which already had formal relations with Israel. It was assumed, certainly in India, we had this sense, that Saudi Arabia would soon follow suit, since it is difficult to imagine that the UAE and Bahrain would have taken such a major step without a Saudi go-ahead. This was also the assumption behind the establishment of the I2U2 grouping, comprising of India and Israel and the UAE and the US in July 2022. It was expected that eventually the grouping would include Egypt and Saudi Arabia. While the I2U2 has been focused on non-security agenda, including issues like water, energy, transportation, space, health, and food security, there is no doubt that it was perceived potentially as an influential coalition backed by US power to serve as a constraining factor on Iran and, by the way, excluding China. The Saudi-Iran and Saudi-Turkey détente has put a question mark on the viability and endurance of the I2U2 process. Clearly, Saudi calculations have changed. India has generally followed a bilateral and to some extent a transactional approach in managing its relations with the countries of the Middle East, and this has been quite successful. it has been able to expand its relations with Arab states, even while consolidating and expanding its relations with Israel. The I2U2 was its first foray into a coalition approach, and this may have been perhaps less than productive in retrospect. The success of India's Middle East policy must therefore be set off against the negative trends in its relations with Iran, which has always been a key partner for India because of long-standing historical and cultural links, but also its role in enabling Indian access to Central Asia, meeting India's energy needs and playing an important role in South Asia itself, particularly in Afghanistan. The Iran-Saudi Accord has, in a sense, diminished India's presence in Iran even further, and of course, has brought salience to China's role in an area which is adjacent to India. In much of the discourse on the Middle East, the fate of the Palestinian people has become a non-issue. The Palestine issue has fallen off the radar screen, and of course this suits Israel. However, our sense is that the Palestine issue is a live and emotional issue on the Arab street, and this was mentioned this morning by Minister from Singapore, even if it is not for the Arab elites. There are bleak prospects for a stable regional order without an equitable settlement of the Palestine issue. It could re-emerge as an explosive issue right at the heart of the Middle East. So is a new security architecture in the Middle East possible? It is certainly desirable, and it is even possible, but in the current regional and geopolitical landscape, to us it seems somewhat improbable. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Shamsaran. You've given a very comprehensive presentation on the Indian perspective, and now we will move to someone who comes from the region herself, someone who comes from a very important player, that is the United Arab Emirates. May I invite Dr. Al-Kitubi. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon. I'm always worrying everybody when I'm starting to speak that I am not diplomat, so excuse me. And thanks for my friend Bilari for this invitation. I'm glad to be here with Middle East Institute for the second time. The growing new dynamics that might reshape the Middle East are not a mirage. And however, they are fragile. And there is no complete agreement on these dynamics. Some might see them as unfair agreements or arrangements by the powerful at the expense of the weak. The arrangements are fragile because the ongoing new compromises and reconciliations have not yet to fulfill the requirement to become sustainable and robust, which I will point towards later in this intervention. The zero-sum game that characterized the behavior of or actions and positions of competing regional actors in recent years in the Middle East failed to achieve the aspired outcomes for each player. In recent years, all countries, Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, my country UAE, Qatar and Iran realized that they could not fulfill their agendas. They also realized that returning to diplomatic and economic solution is more feasible and urgent than military ones. Almost all countries are convinced of the feasibility of de-escalation in the region. Of course, global shift left their impact on the choices of regional actors. Great power competition is at the top of these shifts. But the Sudan issue seems an exception, a controversial case in this context. I mean, sticking to the military solution to impose political condition and exert influence. Despite several calls for calm and dialogue, despite all mediation by Saudi, by others, so the calm, de-escalation and reconciliation environment has not included the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and this is fundamental, shows that which Abraham Accord seeks, this is at least from UAE perspective, to find a solution for this conflict, or chronic conflict, I would say. When it's initiate the Abrahamic Accord. There are also no respects for diplomatic and sustainable solution for the Renaissance Dam between Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan. It is not yet known whether the armed conflict in Sudan would complicate this or facilitate a path for dialogue among rivals on this issue. In strategic calculations, the Abraham Accords have led to significant shifts in the geopolitics of the Middle East and North Africa. It has created a new structure for any regional security approach or plans, as there are consistent attempts to align Washington's priorities, goals, and interests of the Middle Eastern regional partners. UAE strategies and plans cannot work without regional stability and cooperation, as regional turmoils and crises harm its interests. That's why these all reconciliation with Turkey, forming Abraham Accords, rapprochement with Iran, trying to bring Syria back to the Arab League. This part of UAE efforts to de-escalate in the region. From this perspective, the actual judgment on the feasibility and importance of these talks and agreement is not about holding it, which is a positive indication anyway. It has to do with its resulting agreement. The agreements should enhance regional stability, open cooperation channels among countries in the region, and help solve intractable crises in Yemen, Lebanon, and developments related to other crises in the. Now, if we talk about Saudi-Iran negotiations, I think there is also a link between that de-escalation and to that. But here I have different view from what has been discussed in the previous sessions, which is, yes, right now, this is fine for both parties, but for the Iranian, it is more strategic, this agreement. to break the isolation, to get more investment for its poor infrastructure and economy, and to take Saudi market to enter other Arab markets. And for the Saudi, it's to at least get out from Yemen with security guarantees, and who could give the security guarantees is the Chinese, whom they've been all these 3 rounds before, and 2 in Baghdad, 1 in Oman, couldn't reach its goals. So that's why the Saudi seeks the Chinese, whom they have good relation with Iran. Now, if you will ask me, this is sustainable, I would say, with Iranian nuclear program going on, with its missiles development, drones, with still its proxies in the region, okay, I don't think a recipe for stability in the region, because Iran did not give up any one of them, except they're asking Houthi to stop firing missile against Saudi, and this depends how much they will invest in the economy, and if something got wrong between the 2 parties, all proxies are there to fire their missiles or to interfere. Now, the shift of the U.S. visions toward the Gulf and Middle East has impelled regional countries to look to for economic integration arrangement and establish understandings and partnership from within the region to enhance regional stability. Now, the arrangement for regional integration and cooperation has been also mentioned, I2U2, but there is others. I also mentioned the Abraham Accord, but we have also the Nakab Forum. We have the summit in Sharm el-Sheikh and Al-Aqaba. We have the Levant Mashriq between Iraq, Egypt, and Jordan, Baghdad and Jordan summit, Baghdad 1, Baghdad 2, and also the UAE, India, France trilateral cooperation initiative. And there is talk about potential bringing Saudi to the I2U2, but there are also conditions Saudi are putting to get something from US. I'm sorry, means I reached, because I put the timer for me. Okay, I will not take long time. I will go directly to the conclusion. I will not take time from you. That the new dynamics in the Middle East regional structures advocate realistic competition between competition management, I would say, and moreover, the prevention of conflict spillover will continue and expand further. These trends are not illusions. However, it will take more time before one can talk about the new regional security architectures and comprehensive and sustainable stability that can address the deep-rooted cause of crisis emerging from time to time, as the focus is often placed on rapid crisis management rather on comprehensive and fair solution and strategic solution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ketbi. I think that that gives a very good perspective, not only from the point of view of the United Arab Emirates, but also from the region as a whole, as to what the Middle East security architecture should look like and what the prospects are. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we shall move on to someone who comes from one of the great powers that has an interest in the Middle East. May I invite Professor Wang Jian? You have your floor.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me? Oh, it's okay. Thank you, Chairman. And I'm also delighted to the organizers' invitation and the host. It's my great honor to participate in the annual conference again. Last time is 2020, before the outbreak of the COVID. It's almost more than 3 years ago. Well, I was invited to talk about Chinese scholars' thinking on the Middle East geopolitical change. I think some other panelists and audience also very concerned about that because they have talked about already. So I will try to focus on several questions. The first is that how to look at the current geopolitical change in the region. Second is how the Chinese scholars thinking about that, especially on the Abraham Accord, because I'm not officials in the government, just provide my own thinking. Second is how to understand China's role in the process of the change. Now let's move to the first part. Well, as we have seen in the last 4 years, the geopolitics in the Middle East region has changed a lot, despite the prevalence of the COVID-19. I think the first thing important is the first important event is the signing of the Abraham Accord between Israel and Bahrain and UAE. I think this is a very important event in the regional geopolitics, maybe in the last half century, something like that. Follow the rapprochement between, follow the reconciliation between Egypt, Jordan, and Israel in 1970s. So as a result, Israel, together with Morocco, Bahrain, and UAE, United States, they created the Negev Forum last year, which will have new summit very soon, next month. I think the second important event is the rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia this spring, because both sides agreed to restore their diplomatic relations and also, withdraw their support for some proxy conflicts in the region. So as a result, we have seen that Syria returned to the Arab League and improved its relations with other Arab countries. And also the civil war in Yemen now is coming to an end. I think this is a very interesting and also very important turning point in the region. Now some people even told me that now we have seen peace movement or peace campaign in the region because more and more countries want to reconcile with the rebels. This is a good sign and also very good improvement. Now, how do Chinese scholars look at this? Well, so far, the Chinese government has not clearly stated its positions on the Abraham Accords. No clear support, but no clear against. Well, given the relationship of the United States and China, I think if there's no clearly against, that means some kind of support. This is very important because they're very difficult. Both countries have their own domestic. Well, in academic circles, we have seen a lot of discussion on this. And, two typical views on this. The first point is emphasized on the significance and impact of Abraham Accords on the regional politics. For example, some of my colleagues, they have a lot of comments published in Chinese, but I'm quoting here in English. For example, Professor Niu Xinchun, he's a professor at the KICR, we call the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations in Beijing. He said that if the establishment of diplomatic relations between Egypt and Israel in 1979 marks the end of an era of war in Arab-Israeli relations, the Abraham Accords marks the beginning of a new era of political security and economic engagement in all aspects of the relations. Another one of my colleagues, Professor Wang Jian, is also professor at the Institute of West Asia and Africa Studies in the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. He wrote that from Egypt to Jordan to the UAE, Bahrain, and other countries, Arabic countries, it is believed that there will be other Arabic countries normalizing their relations with Israel. This is a trend that reflects both the changing geopolitical landscape of the region and the decline of Arabic nationalism, which was very popular in the 1970s, 1960s. Actually, we have many colleagues has comments. I don't want to mention one by one here. The second typical point is more cautious on the prospect of the Abraham Accords. For example, Marshall, a commentator and also columnist in China, he said that any efforts and progress towards peace in the region deserves recognition. It's very positive. But the exemplary value of the Abraham Accords should not be overestimated. Especially, there's no real peace for the Palestinians. So the main concern for the Chinese scholars lies mainly on the impact of the Abraham Accords on Palestinian issues. So do we have the peace for the Palestinian or for the Middle East peace process, something like that? Because, well, I don't want to explain more details on this, but we can discuss later. My personal view is that most Chinese scholars, maybe including some officials, we are very happy to see the rapprochement or the reconciliation between Israel and the Arabic countries. So far, China maintained its commitment to Palestinians since the 1970s. But we have had a very pragmatic cooperation and engagement with Israel since 1990s. Last year, we have a seminar in my research center, Jewish Research Center in Shanghai. We have a seminar to celebrate the 30 years anniversary of China and Israel. We have diplomatic relations from 1992. We invited some former ministers and former ambassadors to join with us online, some in person. The most important context for China and Israel has a diplomatic relation is that the moderate peace process is started. This is very important. So I think we'd like to see that. And China does not want to take side between the two sides. We just want to keep the relations with both sides, keep a very delicate balance. Last question I want to talk about is how to understand China's role in the Saudi Arabia and Iranian rapprochement this spring. Well, most people, most medias, they tend to look at this event in the lens of a great power competition. Because from 2018, the China and the United States relations deteriorating very fast, and the Abraham Accords was moderated and supported by the United States, and Iran and Saudi Arabia's rapprochement was moderated by China, and Iran was still regarded by the United States as a kind of enemy. So it's very natural, it's very easy to believe or to think that this maybe is a kind of reflections of the China-US great power competitions. But to be frank, my own understanding is that this is not very correct. It's not, at least is incomplete. Because China's involvement in the Iran and Saudi relations is not new. It's not after the deterioration of China-US relations. I still remember in the January in the 2016, when the both countries, the Iranian and Saudi Arabia, when their conflicts broke out, and President Xi Jinping has a plan to visit there. And we have a lot of discussions. Some of my colleagues strongly suggest that it's not a time to make a state visit there because they have some kind of conflicts. But Xi insisted on his visiting according to his plan. So the work is not from now. It's more than that. 2016, it was in the United States, it was the Obama administration. So the China and the US relations were still stable. So this is my first point. Second is that some people may believe that because China has more and more economic cooperations with many Middle East countries, we are the largest trade partners with many the Middle East countries, including some United States alliance. So some believe that maybe China is trying to use the economy as a leverage to influence the regional countries. But actually, this is not really true. We do have a lot of economic cooperation, so we do have some kind of influence, maybe more stronger than 20 years ago. But the essence, the key elements for the rapprochement between Iranian and Saudi Arabia is not from China's pressure. It's from their own desire for development and peace. This is very important. But one thing I want to mention is that in this process, both sides believe China, because China keeps a long-standing policy of non-interference. So they believe China that we never support one side against the other side. So when join the credibility there, so we succeed. So this is very important for us to understand that, because it's not because of pressure, because from their own desire. This is very, very important. The last thing I want to say is that when we understand the Iranian and Saudi Arabia approachment, and also China's diplomatic success, if you can say it's kind of success, I think that it's not just a physical one, but also in a psychological one. So in China, we're just trying to provide a kind of a way in diplomatic, in thinking, how to think about the relationship, how to think about the war and peace. Sometimes the war is not so simple in black and white, not always zero games. I think this is very important. So we have to respect their own choice and bring the peace development for them. We have discussions with some Iranian counterparts several days ago. They really want to develop themselves. So if we think from their side, you have different understanding on development and securities. And we have to respect the regional people's choice, respect their own desire. I think this is very important. I think and China's policy, it basically is rooted from its Oriental cultures. We see the world is more colorful, not just white and black. We're also very cautious on the war. More people are talking about the war games, something like that. So I will stop here, and thank you, and I will look forward to comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wang, for giving us your perspective on what the Chinese scholars and others think in China about the Middle East. Ladies and gentlemen, we now move on to the next speaker. I wouldn't say that he's the last speaker, but he's the next speaker, Mr. Michael Singh. He's someone who's I've had access to, and I would imagine, very close links with people on the Hill in Washington as well as in the administration. Mr. Singh, you have the floor.
Thanks very much. Well, first let me say thank you for the invitation. It's wonderful to be back here. And thank you especially to MEI. I think this topic of great power competition, so-called great power competition in the Middle East, is a very important one. I think really no institute is doing better work on it than MEI, and so it's always a pleasure to visit here. I'm cognizant I'm the fourth of four speakers, and so I'll try to be brief and telegraphic so that you can all have a chance to answer your questions, and also so much has already been said about the United States, and so maybe you're tired of hearing about us. So let me talk about how American officials or American policymakers conceive of this idea of a new Middle Eastern security architecture. And to answer the question, is it a mirage? I think the answer is no, at least not from the American perspective. It's something that's quite real and something that the Biden administration, like the Trump administration, is trying to put into effect. One thing I've learned from my Chinese friends is that people remember numbered lists, and so I'm going to give you 4 pillars and 4 constraints for a new Middle Eastern security architecture from the U.S. perspective. So the 4 pillars. The first pillar is that a new Middle Eastern security architecture will be a networked architecture. And what I mean by that is, if you think of the old Middle East security architecture as being hub and spoke, where each country had a strong relationship with the United States and privileged that relationship with the United States in the defense sphere, but didn't necessarily focus on multilateral defense cooperation. The future that the United States would like to see for Middle Eastern security is a networked future, where you have much stronger multilateral relationships within the region, much stronger multilateral cooperation, hopefully to the point where you don't necessarily need the United States to be a part of every action or every discussion, even though it perhaps is built on a foundation of American technology and American military coordination through CENTCOM. I think 2 things which make this quite possible today are, number one, the threat of Iran, and despite the normalization between the UAE and Iran, between Saudi Arabia and Iran, there's no doubt that Iran is still the threat which most of our partners in the region, and many partners outside the region, are most concerned about. And I think you can see this not just with respect to the nuclear program, but also with respect to Iran's other activities. I mean, you can look in the Wall Street Journal today, and there's a lot of concern being expressed by Emirati officials about the seizure of oil tankers by the Iranians. And of course, these normalization deals haven't stopped Iran from engaging in this sort of activity. But the other new element, which makes this sort of idea of a networked model more possible, is Israel's normalization with key Arab states, hopefully with Saudi Arabia in the future, but already we see plenty of tacit Israeli-Saudi cooperation. But just as much as the Abraham Accords, also Israel's integration into Central Command, into CENTCOM. So even those Middle Eastern states which do not recognize Israel diplomatically, like Saudi Arabia, effectively coordinate every day with Israel through the good offices of CENTCOM. And the Israelis have been very forward-leaning, and we'll have Yuval and some other Israelis who can speak to this directly. The Israelis have been very forward-leaning about sharing their expertise and their know-how and their intelligence with their partners around the region, those who recognize Israel diplomatically and those who don't. I think we also hope to see a role for other powers in the region, especially European states, as well as India. And it was good to hear the Indian perspective earlier. And obviously the U.S. has significant hopes for Indian engagement in the region. I will say that I think so far that's been more economic than security focused, and that might be the case for some time going forward, but not necessarily forever. The second pillar is it will not just be networked, but it will be autonomous. Not really autonomous, but I use this as shorthand to reflect that increasingly the United States is trying to encourage partners to adopt emerging technologies to address long-standing security threats. And you can see this, for example, in the deployment of sort of naval or maritime UAVs in the Gulf and in the Arabian Sea, for example. So threats that previously would have required sending capital ships to investigate now can be detected and investigated using unmanned technologies. And that is a significant shift because it helps, just like the first pillar, helps free key U.S. resources to go to other regions, whether that's Europe or whether that's Asia, without necessarily resulting in a diminution of the sort of security presence of the United States in the region. We compare that potentially with advances in artificial intelligence. That's, I think, a more controversial and a more difficult area to delve into, but it's undoubtedly one where we'll see progress very quickly in the next few years, moving from just autonomous technology to technology which also incorporates AI. I'll say that this shift has actually, in a way, been a more difficult shift culturally, and here I mean strategic culture, not culture in the broader sense, for U.S. partnerships in the region. Because what U.S. partners in the region often want to see is they want to see aircraft carriers, they want to see large ships, and so forth. They want to buy those things from the United States. And increasingly what U.S. officials are trying to convince partners of is that these are not necessarily the best technologies to invest in for the types of threats that we face. It's not nearly as exciting to deploy a fleet of small drones as it is to deploy a fleet of large ships. But increasingly, they're the more useful technology. The third pillar is that the Middle Eastern security architecture will still be U.S.-centric. And what I mean by this is not necessarily that there will be constant American intervention. I think the period of heavy American intervention in the Middle East is largely over. Iran is still the wild card there. I don't rule out the possibility you could have an American military intervention against Iran. I think it's important that possibility remain credible, in fact. But I think the era which ultimately lasted maybe around a decade plus, of heavy American intervention militarily in the Middle East, I think has largely come to a close. But still, you have the United States as the most important and heaviest arms exporter to the region, and so the extent to which Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and other partners are building up their military capabilities, they're doing it on an American defense platform, which not only is good for their bilateral relations with the United States, but it ensures interoperability across the region. But I think you'll also see, and you'll have to see, a role for direct American deterrence and intervention still. And I mentioned Iran, and that is the key threat. I think we can't step back entirely from that role because there is no other state that can fill that role. I think the hope of the United States is that American intervention can become more infrequent, that it can we can contribute our military capabilities sort of at the higher end, whereas our partners would contribute more of the day-to-day work of defending our mutual interests. But I think this has to remain on the table. I think that this is possibly the most controversial point of all of this in Washington itself. I think our partners in the region understand it well, and I think there's a desire from U.S. partners in the region for continued sort of direct American military presence. I think in the U.S., it's much more a matter of debate. I will say, though, where I differ from Martin and from others is I don't see the U.S. is not an offshore balancer in the Middle East, not by any definition, because we're still heavily present in the Middle East. We have many bases there and lots of troops and lots of forces. We're not going to move towards becoming an offshore balancer anytime in the near future. Not in the real sense of the term. Could we draw back from where we have been? Yes, we've already actually started doing that. But that doesn't lead to being an offshore balancer at its end point, I think. The fourth pillar is that Middle East security architecture is in the way we see it in Washington is not just about the Middle East. And I think this is a very important point. We've seen lots of shifts in the Middle East in recent years. We've seen, for example, the center of gravity in the region shift from the Levant to the Gulf, I would say, especially post-Arab Spring. But I think one thing we've also seen in recent years is the desire and the ability of key Middle Eastern partner states, especially Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Israel, to act beyond the region. Not in terms of direct military intervention necessarily, but they've become important security players, security in the broad sense, maybe not quite globally yet, but certainly in neighboring regions. And I think one sort of point of emphasis you'll see in speeches by U.S. officials about the Middle East. So, for example, Jake Sullivan just spoke at my institute about the Biden administration's Middle East strategy. And one point on which he emphasized very clearly was that the Biden administration is looking to coordinate with Riyadh and with Abu Dhabi and so forth on global challenges, not just on regional challenges. And so increasingly in Washington, we think of the Middle East as a place where you have increasingly capable, medium-sized partners that can play sort of niche roles, perhaps, in different security issues. We see the Middle East as the western flank of the Indo-Pacific, although what the implications are of that, we're not yet sure of, and I think our partners are not yet sure of. But also we can see, I think, in the context of the Ukraine war, sort of apropos of the last panel, how important the Middle East has been to the prosecution of that conflict. You have Iran providing drones to Russia. You have the role of OPEC+. It's what produced President Biden's first trip to the Middle East, to Saudi Arabia, despite some tough words for Saudi Arabia during the presidential campaign. It was, ultimately, it was a little bit of domestic politics and to some extent the war in Ukraine, which shows how the Middle East, again, has sort of a global role to play, for better or for worse. And so this is the fourth pillar of this new Middle East security architecture, is that it's not just about the Middle East. It goes well beyond that. So the four constraints, very briefly, some of them I think are obvious, maybe some less so. Number one is partner capacity and will. One of the key projects of decades now for Washington is trying to build partner capacity and to build partner will and ability to engage in military operations, not independently, but taking the lead in certain military operations. I would say where we've had the greatest success would be, say, with Israel and the UAE for various reasons, but there's been less success elsewhere around the region. And so we're looking to be more successful with more partners in the region. Second would be U.S. will and capacity, and I think this is a big question mark for our partners in the region. And we've heard it already here at this conference. Is the U.S. still willing to exercise its military power in the Middle East? I think many of our partners have already concluded, for example, that an Iranian nuclear weapon is something which will come to pass, and they chalk it up as a failure for the United States. I think that, to some extent, that's fair. To some extent, I think that story is not completely concluded yet, and so I would regard it as still an open question. But there is also not just a question of American will, but a question of American capacity. And I think that the Ukraine war has illuminated this in a troubling way, actually. That the United States defense industrial base, and even more so the European defense industrial base, has been significantly stressed by the war in Ukraine. And that's created real concerns about our ability to intervene in conflicts elsewhere. That's most written about in terms of the potential conflicts in Asia. But of course, it's also a relevant point with respect to Iran and conflicts in the Middle East. And so there is a sense in the United States that we need to strengthen and revitalize our defense industrial base, and that U.S. capacity is not unlimited, which is, for better or worse, sometimes the way we talk about it. The third constraint, we lack often a common vision with our partners in the region on internal security. And so we see that when the United States talks about security, we tend to talk about external security. And when we talk about security cooperation, we mean against external threats, whether it's Iran, transnational jihadist groups, and so forth. Oftentimes when our partners think about security threats, they're also thinking about internal security threats. And this is a place where the United States hasn't sort of found necessarily the same kind of common ground with partners that we have on the external threats. And it's some place where, frankly, China, I think, has seen an opportunity to fill a gap, and that's of significant concern in Washington. And then fourth, and very clearly, and this gets to everything that Professor Wong was just talking about, that's the intention of other global powers. Whether Middle East security architecture for the United States will become a question of U.S.-China competition, or whether it won't, depends, in large part on China's own intentions and China's own strategy for the region. And I don't think there's a clear understanding in Washington of what China's strategy in the Middle East is. There's not much discussion of it or writing about it, and even those who write about it, I think, are humble about their ability to understand it. I will say, in response to some of the comments earlier today about sort of the U.S. mistakes in Iraq and Afghanistan, if you look at great powers acting, especially outside their regions, they all tend to make the same kinds of mistakes. So you can go back to, say, the British in Burma in the 1880s and 1890s. You can go to the Soviets in Afghanistan. And frankly, yes, you can talk about the U.S. in Iraq and Afghanistan. I think this should give us a little bit of pause and be concerning when we start thinking about great power competition in the Middle East and how it's likely to play out in the future. Because this is not just a problem of American foreign policy from a certain sort of time frame, but it's actually, for better or worse, a feature of great power competition around the world for a much longer historical period. So the Middle East has obviously been, again, for better or worse, an arena or a theater for great power competition for most of its history. The period of sort of the U.S. being the sole and most powerful external power in the Middle East was actually relatively short in the historical sweep. And so we probably are seeing now a new era where that is over and where there will be more competition amongst external powers in the region. What exactly that looks like, I think we don't yet know, and we'll see. Thanks very much.
Sorry, I have two questions. First of all, what will be the impact of Trump re-election on the stability in the Gulf, especially with what happened recently between Saudi Arabia and Iran? Trump impact. The second thing, the improved relationship between the GCC and China and GCC and Iran, does it reflect less trust in the U.S. policy and U.S. posing threats? Like U.S. keep mentioning about the threat of China or threat of Iran to GCC. However, the relationship between GCC and Iran and China are improving. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. That was not directed at anyone on the panel. Yeah? Is it? Would you like to take that on, Mike?
So maybe I'll talk about the Trump administration and these issues. I think that we are at a time now where we see partisan differences in the United States over some of these foreign policy issues, but not all of them. And so what will be different? I think Iran policy will absolutely be different. This is something which has become highly polarized in the United States in recent years. It wasn't always the case. In the past, you'd have votes of the Senate on Iran bills, and they'd be 100-0 votes. Now, ever since the conclusion of the JCPOA in 2015, there has been this sort of pendulum swinging back and forth. This is not, I'm not sharing anything new with anyone. And so that pendulum, I think, would swing back again in the direction of sanctions and perhaps confrontation if we had not just the Trump administration, but likely any Republican administration. I think there'd be a much heavier emphasis on pressure and deterrence and probably less hope for diplomacy, even though diplomacy was part of the Trump administration policy. On other issues that we're talking about, I think there would be less of a difference. You would have some sort of differences which are superficial. So, for example, you would have probably warmer, friendlier relations between some of our Gulf partners in the United States, which have been strained during the Biden administration. But ultimately, the desire to shift our priorities in the world, to focus more resources and attention on Asia, to a lesser extent on Europe, to have a new Middle East security architecture, these things are not points of significant difference in Washington. There may be differences over the details of what exactly that looks like. But the idea that we need a sort of new strategic direction, and that in fact one is overdue, I think is one that's shared in Washington by both Republicans and Democrats. The second question maybe I'll leave to another panelist.
Yeah. Relations between China and the Gulf countries.
Look, the Gulf countries, they don't look to China as a threat. And they are looking at it as an economic partner. They know, as has been mentioned in the previous panel, that in terms of security, military umbrella, it's always about US. But they know that China cannot guarantee their security. But as I said, of course, that mediation between Iran and Saudi, it wasn't because of China's without its interests. Stable Gulf is stable for the oil transportation going to China. Okay, conflict will affect that. Now, it's not and nothing about love in the international relation. It's about interest. There is interest. That relation will continue as it is. There is no interest. You end by either cold relation or conflict.
All right, thank you. There's another gentleman over here, please.
Thank you. My name is Asif Shuja. I'm from the Middle East Institute, Singapore. We are sitting here in Southeast Asia, and we also have a certain security architecture which has worked very successfully for this region. We haven't seen much of violent conflict. We are discussing here about the Middle East security architecture. So my question to all the panelists, including the moderator, would be, are there any best practices of Southeast Asian security architecture that could be applied to Middle East security architecture? Thank you.
Okay. Any best practices that can be looked at in the context of South Asia or the Indo-Pacific? Let me start off a little bit on that. Since I mentioned it earlier in my introduction, I think, of course, there is the network of relationships that has already developed, be it in the context of ASEAN, APEC, the various other forms of relationships, Quad, and so on and so forth. But I would imagine each region is unique in itself, in the security concerns and other interests, and are different from one region to another. You can't simply transform something that you find in Southeast Asia or Europe to the Middle East or elsewhere. That's the way I see it, but it's not for me. I'm just the moderator. It's the panelists who may want to comment on it. Sham, please.
Yeah, okay. So, looked at from our perspective, of course, Southeast Asia has been extremely successful in creating a network of relationships with other major powers. So you have the, ASEAN plus the defense ministers meetings, you have the ASEAN regional forum. So these do play a very important role in sustaining a much more congenial atmosphere. But, we also need to be somewhat realistic in this respect. For example, ASEAN has not been able to successfully deal with, say, the Myanmar issue, despite its efforts. It is also, from an outsider, one sees that ASEAN has its cake and eats it too, in a sense, because it has a very strong and complementary economic relationship with China, which is brought its great economic benefits. But while they may not be stated very clearly, it is also still very heavily dependent upon a very, very strong US military presence in this region. So the effort seems to be look to the United States to ensure security, but look to China to ensure its economic benefits. Riding these two horses at the same time may become more difficult later if the polarization that we see, or confrontation that we see between US and China, if it sharpens, then this kind of very, shall I say, somewhat happy situation may not last very long.
Thank you. Any other? Yes. Okay. Please.
Thank you, Mike, for coming again. He came here the last time when we talked about Iran and JCPOA. And that time it was like managed chaos. Now in his presentation it looks a lot more like managed urgency stroke desperation. But what I want to ask really is, but you have invested 50 odd years in the Middle East. What's happened to Egypt? And then what's happened to Turkey, who is part of NATO, part of you, but sort of in NATO? So it's very neat, but when it comes to play, there are complications.
Okay. Mike, you're on the floor.
Well, so what's happened to Turkey, what's happened to Egypt, I think that Obviously, there are very different stories in each case, but I'll try to generalize maybe a little bit because it might be more interesting. Turkey, I think, is its own case. We've just seen an election in Turkey where we have the re-election of President Erdogan, and that in itself is a complicated story. And I think in the West, there is a great deal of concern about democratic backsliding in Turkey, yet also a recognition that, especially because we are in this new era of great power competition in this region, Turkey is an essential partner. And so trying to navigate that is really the challenge with Turkey. I would say if you look at the rest of the region, one thing that you just haven't seen enough of in the Middle East is economic and political reform over time. And I think we can't leave out the economic, because we tend to focus on the political, the lack of democracy, the sort of persistence of authoritarian regimes and so forth. But the lack of economic reform and the lack of economic transformation has also been troubling. And we have, seen some of it, especially in recent years, in places like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, which are encouraging in a way. I think, in fact, the economic transformation story in Saudi Arabia doesn't get enough attention in the West, frankly. I think we don't understand it as well as we could because we focused on other issues, rightly or wrongly. But across the rest of the region, we simply haven't seen that kind of progress, despite different administrations pushing in different ways with different levels of vigor for it. I'm not sure what the answer is there, frankly. I think that increasingly in Washington, we're inclined to focus on interests and to focus on security, because there is a sense that our past efforts to focus on political reform and economic reform not only didn't work, but may have actually sort of been setbacks, in a sense. But I wonder how long that will last, because I do think that ultimately, if you look at phenomena like the Arab Spring, they have at their root, especially this sense of economic discontent, I think, more than anything. And so you can't really separate politics, economics, and security. You have to somehow balance those three things, which is extremely challenging in any region, including this region.
So anyway, can we have a couple more questions? Yes, there's a gentleman over here, please.
Thank you, Tan Sri. I have a couple of questions. One is with regards to when we look at all of these issues, we're looking at it from a rather high, rather state perspective. In the Middle East, generally, when trouble starts, it often starts from the ground up. And all of these changes that are taking place now, recognition of Israel, improvement of relations, I'd like to get a sense of what is the ground up perception of views of these things, of these developments. Are the people generally happier with the direction in which the policies are going? Are there concerns about external engagement as they have been in the past? Americans often see themselves as liberators. People in the Middle East often see them as invaders, right? So there's a very different perspective. So if you could share a little bit of a view on how the ground up sees these developments. The second question is with regards to India. As India's role in Asia grows, how does Indian policymaker, how do they see the trade-off between what India is being asked to do in Indo-Pacific versus India's interest in the Middle East? How do you balance those two competing to some extent, desires that the global architecture has for India? Thank you.
Thank you. There are two questions. One is the view from essentially the Arab Street. Dr. Al-Kizbi, would you like to take on that question?
If I generalize, I would say most of the Arab Street are nationalist, okay? But in general, the Arab streets mainly focus on the issue of the day-by-day life, okay? The issue of mostly the economy and the cause of those upheaval under Arab Spring, it was economy. Okay. the freedom of speech, the liberal democracy, are for the elites. I mean, in the opposition. But if you focus mainly, and if you go to the youth, they want job, okay? They want better future, jobs, good living, okay? This is what they are. Now, which it can come with good governance. And I think UAE is an example of that, okay? It's not a hope for its people only, it's a hope now for all Arab youth whom they are seeking to come to UAE. In fact, for others, I passed by one Filipino girl, she's in one shop, and she said, you know what, I am here, I want to die here, because here at least I feel safe. I can go at 3 p.m. and I am not afraid. And my brother, he regret that he went to Canada. He wants to come back to UAE. So what lesson they got from Arab Spring, that nation state is really something you have to hold, because those states fragmented, especially look to Syria, look to the others, they thought that they regret the previous regime because it was stable. In fact, there is some Iraqis whom they were suffered from Saddam regime. They regret that because what happened after that upheaval or American invasion of Iraq, that in Iraq it was secular, now becoming too much rigid under Iranian regime, and it's not secular anymore, and it's not stable and not secure, okay? And in fact, you removed one Saddam and you brought 1,000 Saddams in Iraq. It can be applicable to any. So if you will choose between safety and security and economics situation, they will choose that instead of. And in fact, what is the United States wants everybody to follow, or even the European, the same path. We have different history, everyone will choose his own path, which is more constant with its social, political, cultural context. You don't have to copy the others, okay? Good governance, this is what the people need. This is the maximum need for them. Because you are talking about Erdogan, a Turkish election, this is what it is a democratic tool. But it brought the same guy again, which is brought Trump also, and brought others. So it's about the content or about the frame itself. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Shamsaran?
Yeah.
The second question, please.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to make a small comment about the first question, and that is, I think there is a lot happening at the ground level in most countries, I would say. And partly it is driven by the fact that there are extreme inequalities of wealth and income which have developed. So I think there is a certain reason why there is a certain degree of turmoil. And the situation is not the same across the region, because if you see Iran, the fact that you have still the sort of feminist movement which has taken hold, how the regime handles it will, in fact, make a difference in terms of what the future would be. I also mentioned in my opening remarks that, the Palestinian issue is an Arab Street issue. And it is a factor which we should take into account with respect to how this will impact on the future. So just a small comment on that. As far as India, the question about how do we link the Indo-Pacific strategy with what our strategy may be with respect to what we call West Asia. For somebody sitting in New Delhi, it is very difficult to sort of separate, like the US sometimes does, between our eastern flank and western flank. In fact, both of these are connected. So we do not see our engagement with West Asia as somehow being a separate issue or in a separate box from what we are doing in the Indo-Pacific. So maybe there are some different preoccupations here. For example, energy security is a much more important preoccupation on this side than it is on the Indo-Pacific side. But I think we are coming to a stage where these two, even not just for India, but for other actors also, it is becoming interconnected. Partly because of the continuing advance of globalization and the fact that as far as economic interests are concerned, these are getting all intertwined. So if we are looking at the Indo-Pacific, energy supplies from the Gulf to the east, all the sea lanes of communication become very important for actors both on this side as well as that side. So what you will increasingly see is that, in fact, these separate sort of strategic spaces are going to become more and more interlinked. And that is how, at least for quite some time, India has been looking at this.
I think it's about time for us to wrap up this session. May I, with your indulgence, invite the panelists, starting with Mike, to give a 1-minute comment on that question. Is it a mirage?
So I gave my answer. The answer is no. I'm going to leave it at that because I don't want to stand between everyone and lunch. So thank you.
Professor Wang Jian?
Answer the same.
Same. Okay.
It's not, but it's not coming so quickly. It will take time.
Yeah, I endorse the comment just made.
Well, let me just rule that there is consensus on this point, following the ASEAN way. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think we've had a very rich discussion on this particular topic and in this particular session. We are very fortunate that we got a very distinguished set of panelists who have given their presentations in a very clear manner. So I think it's now for us to thank them by giving them a big hand of applause.